In a high-rise office at 2:15 a.m., the hum of our $20 million a day system stopped and I knew exactly whose fingerprints were on the knife. But this wasn't a bug. It was a slow-motion train wreck I'd seen coming for weeks. And the best part, I had every receipt ready before the first scream. The server room's emergency lights cast long shadows across my laptop screen, where Brandon's commits glowed like a confession written in code. My name is Rachel Myers, and I've spent 17 years building systems that move $20 million every single day through the digital arteries of Chicago's financial district. At 42, I've outlasted 3 CEOs, 5 major restructurings, and countless young hotshots who thought they could revolutionize everything with a few lines of trendy code. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the silence that fell across Northgate Financial Technologies at 2:15 a.m. on that February morning. The server room should never be quiet. It should hum with the steady rhythm of cooling fans, the soft whir of hard drives, the barely perceptible clicks of data flowing through switches. That night, as I sat alone in the glow of multiple monitors, the silence was deafening. 3 million users' transactions hung suspended in digital limbo, frozen mid-execution like insects trapped in amber. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up system logs, checking connection statuses, running diagnostics I could perform in my sleep. The pattern emerged too quickly. This wasn't random failure or age-related decay. This was surgical, deliberate, and bore the distinctive signature of incompetence masquerading as innovation. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in that sickly amber glow that makes even the most modern office feel like a morgue. My phone buzzed incessantly, alerts from monitoring systems, panicked messages from the overnight team in Mumbai, automated warnings from partner banks detecting the anomaly, but I didn't need any of them to tell me what I already knew. The Phoenix Loop 2.0 deployment had gone live 6 hours ago, and our revolutionary new system was eating itself alive. I pulled up the commit history, and there it was, glowing on my screen like a neon confession, Brandon Kerr's latest optimization, pushed to production without review, without testing, without the basic courtesy of understanding what he was destroying. The fail-safe clause I'd written 5 years ago, the one that prevented cascade failures during high-volume processing, had been commented out with a single note: removing redundant legacy code, BK. The irony wasn't lost on me. That single line of redundant legacy code was the only thing standing between normal operations and complete system collapse during our peak East Coast pre-market processing window. And Brandon, our CEO's golden nephew, our 25-year-old technical strategist, with his Stanford MBA and his complete lack of actual coding experience, had deleted it like he was cleaning out old files from his desktop. I'd warned them. God, how I'd warned them. 3 weeks of emails, documented concerns, careful explanations of why certain inefficiencies were actually safeguards. Each message had been met with corporate speak about trusting the process and embracing transformation. The latest response from our CTO had been particularly memorable. Your concerns have been noted and will be taken under advisement. The temperature in the server room dropped another degree as the HVAC system struggled to compensate for the overheating processors. Somewhere in this building, Brandon was probably sound asleep in his luxury apartment, yes. The company had provided him with a penthouse unit in the building, because apparently, a 6-figure salary wasn't enough for the CEO's sister's son. But I wasn't angry, not anymore. Anger had burned through me weeks ago when I'd first seen him swagger into our morning stand-up, interrupting my technical brief to explain how we were thinking too small and needed to disrupt ourselves before someone else did. No, what I felt now was something far more dangerous: cold, calculated satisfaction. Because while Brandon had been playing Silicon Valley startup in our production environment, I'd been documenting everything. Every ignored warning, every bypassed protocol, every commit that violated our safety standards, screenshots, emails, logs, timestamps, all meticulously organized in a folder I'd named When It Happens, because in 17 years, I'd learned that in corporate America, being right means nothing if you can't prove it, and proving it means nothing if you don't time it perfectly. 17 years at Northgate Financial Technologies had taught me that survival wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, it was about being the one who understood how the room was built. I'd started here as a junior developer fresh out of Northwestern, debugging COBOL systems that processed wire transfers for Fortune 500 companies. Back then, the office was 6 floors in a building that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. Now we occupied a 40-story glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. But underneath all that architectural glamour, the same ancient code I'd helped modernize still processed 70% of our transactions. I was the architect of that transformation, not the face of it that honor went to a rotating cast of executives who took credit for digital innovation at shareholders' meetings. But every critical module, every fail-safe, every redundancy that kept $20 million flowing daily through our systems bore my fingerprints. The authentication protocols that hadn't been breached in a decade mine. The transaction reconciliation system that caught a $12 million fraud attempt last year, also mine. The load balancer that seamlessly handled Black Friday traffic spikes, I'd written it during a particularly brutal audit season, fueled by nothing but spite and gas station coffee. The company had changed CEOs 3 times during my tenure. First was Morrison, who'd hired me a heart attack at 58 took him down. Then came Patel, brilliant but burned out after 2 years of board politics. Now we had Richard Kerr, a smooth-talking former Goldman Sachs executive who spoke in TED Talk soundbites and believed every problem could be solved with synergy and thinking outside the box. 3 months ago, Kerr had announced Innovation Forward with the fanfare of a product launch, standing in our newly renovated amphitheater. We had an amphitheater. Now he'd proclaimed that Northgate would revolutionize financial technology for the next generation. The centerpiece of this revolution, Phoenix Loop 2.0, a complete rebuild of our transaction processing system using cutting-edge cloud-native architecture and AI-driven optimization. The technical team had exchanged knowing glances. We'd been through this before. Every new CEO needed a flagship project, something to stamp their name on. Usually, we'd spend 6 months in meetings, produce some impressive PowerPoints, make minor improvements to the existing system, slap a new interface on it, and call it transformation. The CEO would get their Wall Street Journal mention, and we'd go back to keeping the lights on. But this time was different. This time, Kerr had brought in his secret weapon, Brandon. The announcement had come during an all-hands meeting in January. "I'd like to introduce our new technical strategist, Brandon Kerr," Richard had said, his arm around a young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a venture capital firm's recruitment brochure. Brandon comes to us from Stanford's MBA program, where he specialized in financial technology innovation. He'll be leading our Phoenix Loop 2.0 initiative. The nepotism was so blatant, it was almost refreshing. At least Kerr hadn't insulted our intelligence by pretending Brandon had gone through the normal hiring process. The kid, and at 25, he was definitely a kid, stood there in his $2,000 suit and Apple Watch, explaining how he'd studied our systems extensively and identified numerous opportunities for optimization. I'd been in the 3rd row, close enough to see the PowerPoint clicker trembling slightly in his hand. His presentation was a masterclass in saying nothing with maximum confidence. Leverage blockchain integration, implement machine learning algorithms, utilize quantum-resistant encryption. It was like he'd swallowed a tech blog and was regurgitating it in random order. What Brandon hadn't mentioned, what his uncle certainly knew but chose to ignore, was that Brandon had never written production code. His Stanford degree was impressive on paper, but his GitHub profile told a different story. A handful of tutorial projects and a half-finished cryptocurrency app that hadn't been updated in 2 years. His LinkedIn endorsements were all from fraternity brothers and family friends. His Medium articles about disrupting traditional finance read like they'd been generated by ChatGPT. But none of that mattered. Brandon was family, and in corporate America, blood trumps competence every time. Within a week, he had an office on the executive floor, a team of junior developers too intimidated to question him, and right access to our production repositories. That's when I'd started my documentation folder. Call it paranoia, call it experience, but I'd seen this movie before. The only difference was that this time, I was going to make sure I had a front row seat for the ending. Brandon's first appearance in our morning stand-up meeting was like watching a peacock stumble into a hardware store. It was a Tuesday, 7:30 a.m., and our core team was gathered in conference room 12B, the one without windows that we'd claimed years ago because executives never wanted it. We were midway through discussing a memory leak in the payment processing module when the door swung open. "Sorry I'm late," Brandon announced. Though nobody had invited him, he was carrying a venti something or other from the artisanal coffee shop downstairs, the one that charged $12 for a latte. Traffic from Lincoln Park was brutal. Marcus, our database administrator, stopped mid-sentence. Sarah from QA looked at me. I kept my expression neutral, though I noticed my pen had stopped moving across my notepad. "Please, continue," Brandon said, settling into a chair at the head of the table, my usual spot. "I'm here to observe and learn about our current pain points." Marcus cleared his throat and continued explaining the memory leak, using precise technical language that had taken years to master. Brandon nodded along, occasionally interjecting with questions that revealed he didn't understand the difference between RAM and storage, or why a memory leak in a financial system handling millions of concurrent transactions was slightly more serious than a crashed iPhone app. "Have we considered just adding more servers?" Brandon suggested when Marcus finished. "That's what we did at my last startup." "Your last startup?" Sarah couldn't help herself. "What was that?" "Oh, a small fintech venture. We were building a revolutionary payment app. Unfortunately, we couldn't secure Series A funding, but the experience was invaluable." I'd looked up that startup later. It had lasted 4 months and never processed a single real transaction. But the real problem started the following week when Brandon discovered our codebase. More specifically, when he discovered the fraud detection module I'd written 3 years ago, a complex piece of logic that analyzed transaction patterns in real time, flagging suspicious activity before it could clear. "This is incredibly inefficient," he announced during a Phoenix Loop 2.0 planning meeting, projecting my code onto the screen. "Look at all these conditional statements. We could replace this entire module with a simple machine learning model." "That code prevents about $6 million in fraud annually," I said calmly. "Each condition handles a specific pattern we've identified from actual attacks." "But it's not scalable," Brandon countered, using the word like a magic spell. "And look at this," he highlighted a section. "This whole fail-safe clause is just dead code. When would a transaction ever need to roll back 17 times? During a distributed denial of service attack combined with a race condition in the—" "Rachel, I appreciate your dedication to the legacy system," Brandon interrupted, his tone suggesting he appreciated nothing of the sort. "But we need to think bigger. This is exactly the kind of redundant paranoia that's holding us back." The room fell silent. CTO Jennifer Williams, who'd been brought in 6 months ago from a social media company, looked up from her phone. "Brandon makes a good point about modernization. Rachel, why don't you document your concerns, and we'll review them in committee." Document my concerns. Corporate speak for, "we're going to ignore you." That night, I stayed until 11 p.m., creating a detailed technical document explaining why each redundancy was actually a critical safeguard. I included case studies, incident reports, even a cost analysis showing how much money these inefficiencies had saved. I sent it to Jennifer, Brandon, Richard Kerr, and half the board. The response came the next morning from Jennifer. "Thank you for your thorough analysis. We'll take this under advisement. Please focus on supporting the Phoenix Loop 2.0 transition." Brandon, emboldened by management's backing, became more aggressive. He started committing directly to the main branch, bypassing code review. His commits had messages like optimizing legacy code and removing unnecessary complexity. Each one was a small disaster waiting to happen. I particularly remember the commit from February 3rd, 3:47 p.m. Removed redundant rollback logic from payment processor. That single commit deleted 300 lines of code I'd written after a catastrophic failure in 2019 that had nearly cost us our largest client. The rollback logic he'd removed was what prevented partial transactions from corrupting account balances during network failures. I took a screenshot, added it to my folder, then I quietly implemented a personal backup system, copying critical code to a private repository before Brandon could optimize it out of existence. "You need to be more of a team player, Rachel," Jennifer told me during my quarterly review. "Brandon says you've been resistant to change." I smiled, nodded, agreed to be more collaborative. Then I went back to my desk and added Jennifer's email to my folder. The email arrived on a Monday morning, buried between a newsletter about blockchain trends and a reminder about the office yoga class. Phoenix Loop 2.0 core team meeting, mandatory attendance. The sender was Brandon, but the CC list was telling every executive except me. Despite the fact that I designed 60% of the system we were supposedly revolutionizing, I showed up anyway. Sometimes the best intelligence comes from meetings you're not supposed to attend. Rachel, this is actually a strategic planning session, Brandon said when I walked in, his smile as thin as his technical knowledge. We're discussing high-level architecture. I don't think we need to trouble you with these details. Of course, I replied, maintaining eye contact just long enough to make him uncomfortable. I'll be at my desk if you need someone who actually understands the architecture. The exclusion was systematic after that. Meeting invites that mysteriously disappeared from my calendar. Slack channels I discovered only when junior developers accidentally mentioned them. Design documents shared with everyone except the person who'd have to fix them when they failed. But Brandon had made a crucial mistake he'd forgotten about Carlos. Carlos Rodriguez was a junior developer from our payment processing team. 23 years old. Brilliant. And more importantly, still possessed of enough integrity to be troubled by what he was seeing. He approached me on a Thursday afternoon, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Rachel, can I ask you something? He glanced around the open office nervously. Privately. We found an empty conference room, the small one on the 7th floor that still had a broken air conditioner from last summer. Carlos pulled out his laptop, fingers trembling slightly as he typed. This morning's deployment, he began, pulling up a system monitor. We're seeing intermittent delays in transaction processing, just milliseconds, but they're adding up. Brandon says it's normal, just the system adjusting to the new code, but he showed me the latency graphs. The pattern was immediately familiar. I'd seen it before. Years ago, right before a catastrophic failure that had taken us offline for 6 hours. The fail-safe clauses, I said quietly. He removed them, didn't he? Carlos nodded. Last week, he called them training wheels and said we needed to let the system run at full speed. But Rachel, when we hit peak load during East Coast Market Open, these delays compound, without the automatic rollback. The system will cascade, I finished. Each delayed transaction creates a bottleneck, which delays the next transaction, which creates a bigger bottleneck. Without the fail-safes to force a reset, it'll keep building until it stops completely, Carlos whispered. I ran a simulation on the test environment. At current transaction volumes, we'd have about 30 minutes from first symptom to total system failure. I leaned back in the uncomfortable conference chair. Considering, Carlos was taking a significant risk coming to me. In the current environment, being seen as aligned with the old guard could be career suicide. Did you document your simulation? I asked. Everything, logs, projections, even a spreadsheet showing potential financial impact. He hesitated. It could be over 40 million in frozen transactions if it happens during peak hours. Send it to Brandon and Jennifer. Copy Richard Kerr. Carlos looked at me like I'd suggested he jump off the building. They'll know I came to you. No. They'll know you did your job. Make it formal, professional. Don't mention my name. Just present it as your findings from routine testing. He sent the email that afternoon at 4:17 p. I know the exact time because I was watching my inbox, waiting for the forward that would inevitably come from someone wanting to gloat. The response came from Jennifer at 4:52 p.m. Thank you for your diligence. Carlos, Brandon has assured me these concerns are addressed in the next sprint. Please coordinate with him directly going forward. Translation shut up and fall in line. Carlos forwarded me the exchange with a single comment. I tried. That evening, I stayed late again, but not to work. I was updating my folder, now renamed When It Happens, because the if had become a when. Screenshots of every dismissed concern, every reckless commit, every warning ignored. I organized them chronologically, added technical annotations, created a timeline that would be comprehensible even to non-technical executives. The production deployment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Brandon had pushed it through by promising the board a 15% improvement in transaction speed. He'd achieved it, technically by removing every safety mechanism I'd built. I made one last attempt, a formal email to the entire board, attaching Carlos's simulation results and my own analysis. The subject line: Critical Risk Assessment, Phoenix Loop 2.0 Deployment. Richard Kerr himself responded this time, at 11:43 p.m. Rachel, I appreciate your passion for our systems. However, we have full confidence in Brandon's leadership of this initiative. Please ensure your team is prepared to support the deployment. I printed that email, added it to a physical folder I kept locked in my desk drawer. Then I went home, poured myself a very expensive glass of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and waited for Tuesday, Sunday night, 36 hours before deployment. I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety I'd moved past that weeks ago, but from the meticulous preparation that revenge requires. My home office looked like a war room, 3 monitors displaying different aspects of our system. Commit logs dating back 6 months, printed emails highlighted and categorized, and in the center of it all, a single USB drive labeled, When It Happens. I went through everything one more time. Brandon's commits were a masterclass in dangerous incompetence. January 15th, removed timeout protocols from the API gateway. January 28th, deleted error handling from the currency conversion module. February 2nd, commented out the database connection pooling limits. Each change accompanied by commit messages like streamlining process or removing bottleneck. The irony was that Brandon genuinely believed he was improving things. I'd overheard him at the coffee machine telling Jennifer how he'd increased efficiency by 40% by removing unnecessary validation steps. He didn't understand that those validations were what prevented a user from accidentally transferring negative billions due to integer overflow or stopped a race condition from duplicating transactions. At 2 a.m., I opened my laptop and started screen recording. I navigated through our repository, capturing every piece of evidence in video format: the removed code, the ignored pull request reviews, the bypass testing protocols, the emergency hotfixes I'd submitted that were rejected as not aligned with the Phoenix Loop vision. Then I did something I'd never done in 17 years. I logged into our production backup system and created a complete mirror of the current stable version. Not to sabotage, I'd never compromised the system I'd helped build, but to ensure that when everything fell apart, I could prove exactly what existed before Brandon's revolution. Monday arrived gray and drizzling, fitting weather for a wake. The office buzzed with nervous energy. The Phoenix Loop 2.0 team had taken over the main conference room, transforming it into what Brandon called a deployment command center. Multiple screens showed system metrics, countdown timers, and a Twitter feed monitoring for any mention of Northgate Financial. I wasn't invited to the command center. Naturally. Instead, I sat at my desk, watching our internal systems through my own monitoring tools. Carlos stopped by around 10 a.m., looking pale. "They're moving the deployment up," he whispered. "Brandon convinced them to launch at market open tomorrow instead of waiting for the maintenance window. He says it'll demonstrate confidence in the system, show the market we're not afraid." Carlos laughed bitterly. He actually used the phrase shock and awe. I pulled up the transaction volume charts from the past month. Tuesday market open averaged 300,000 transactions in the first hour. Our current system handled that comfortably with the fail-safes engaged. Without them, "Carlos," I said quietly, "make sure you have everything backed up personally. Your code, your documentation, everything." He understood immediately. "It's that bad. Take a sick day tomorrow if you can." "I can't. Brandon made attendance mandatory for all engineering staff. We're supposed to be all hands on deck for the historic launch." Historic. He had no idea how right he was. I spent the rest of Monday creating my final documentation package, a PDF with embedded screenshots, code comparisons, and a detailed timeline. I wrote an executive summary in language even board members could understand, explaining how each removed safeguard corresponded to a specific type of system failure. I included Carlos's simulation results, my own projections, and conservative estimates of financial impact. Then I wrote a separate document, a technical post-mortem of a disaster that hadn't happened yet. I detailed exactly how the system would fail, in what order, and how long each stage would take. I even included remediation steps, though I knew they wouldn't be implemented in time. At 6 p.m., security did their rounds, gently reminding people to go home. I packed up slowly, making sure my USB drive was secure in my bag. As I passed the command center, I could see Brandon holding court, gesturing at a whiteboard covered with meaningless buzzwords. Jennifer was nodding along, checking her phone. Richard Kerr had even made an appearance, clapping Brandon on the shoulder like a proud father. I stopped at the doorway, just long enough for Brandon to notice me. He paused mid-sentence, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite fear, but maybe the first shadow of doubt. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes, and continued walking. That night, I backed up everything to 3 different cloud services and a physical drive I stored in my bank's safety deposit box. I set up automated scripts to capture system logs in real time, routing copies to my personal server. I even configured alerts to my personal phone for when specific error patterns appeared. Then I took a long bath, had a glass of wine, and went to bed at 10 p.m. I needed to be at the office early. History was about to be made, and I had a front row seat to the explosion. My phone alarm was set for 4 a.m. By 4:30, I'd be in the office, ready to watch Brandon's revolution eat itself alive. And when it did, when the panic set in and the finger-pointing started, I'd be ready with every piece of evidence needed to ensure the blame landed exactly where it belonged. Tuesday, February 11th, 4:30 a.m. The office was a tomb of blue screen light and humming servers. I badged in through the executive entrance, a privilege from my early years that IT had never revoked, and made my way to my desk. The deployment was scheduled for 8:30 a.m., synchronized with market open, 4 hours to set up my observation post. I arranged my monitors like a mission control setup. Left screen real-time transaction logs, center system performance metrics, right the Phoenix Loop 2.0 deployment dashboard that I wasn't supposed to have access to but did, thanks to a junior developer who'd shared his credentials months ago. Below them all, my laptop displayed our internal Slack channels, email, and the USB drive folder labeled "When It Happens." By 7 a.m., the office started filling up. The Phoenix Loop team arrived in branded t-shirts Brandon had ordered, black with a golden phoenix rising from pixelated flames. "Disrupting Finance" was printed on the back. I watched them file into the command center, young faces bright with the excitement of those who didn't know what they were about to unleash. 7:45 a.m. Markets would open in 45 minutes. I pulled up our transaction queue. Already, pre-market orders were stacking up, international transfers from Asian markets, automated trading algorithms preparing their opening positions, millions of individual transactions waiting for the bell. 8:15 a.m. Brandon's voice echoed from the command center, loud enough to hear across the floor. "Today, we make history. Phoenix Loop 2.0 goes live in 15 minutes. Everyone to your stations." I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing "Phoenix Loop 2.0 deployment, real-time incident log." I added a timestamp, 8:16 a.m., system stable, current transaction rate 12,000 per minute. 8:25. The final pre-deployment checks. On my screen, I watched Brandon override 3 warning flags about missing integration tests. Jennifer approved each override without reading them. 8:29 a.m. 1 minute to deployment. The transaction queue had swelled to over 200,000 pending operations. My fingers hovered over my keyboard, ready to document everything. 8:38. Phoenix Loop 2.0 is live. Brandon's announcement was met with applause from the command center. On my screens, I watched the new code propagate through our servers like a virus through a bloodstream. For exactly 7 minutes, everything worked perfectly. Transaction speeds were indeed faster. Brandon's promised 15% improvement was actually closer to 18%. The command center erupted in celebration. Someone popped champagne. I documented it all. 8:37 a.m. Initial metrics show increased throughput, no apparent errors. 8:38. The first hiccup. So small you'd miss it if you weren't looking. A transaction delay in the European market gateway. 100 milliseconds. Nothing critical. But I knew what it meant the first